morning they took the IV out of my arm, I asked the nurse if I could keep the needle cap. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I wanted something small and real to hold on to. Something that proved I was still here, still breathing, still a person with a body that worked. She handed it to me without a word. I held that little plastic cap for 3 days before I finally threw it away. My name is Edward Calloway. I'm 69 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the city of Portland, Oregon. I built bridges, or helped build them, reviewed the calculations, signed off on the low tolerances, made sure the math was right before anyone drove across. I was a man who trusted numbers, who trusted process, who believed that if you followed the steps correctly, you get a safe outcome. I don't know how to explain what happened to me without first telling you about my son. His name is Brandon. He was born on a Tuesday in February, during a snowstorm that shut down most of Multnomah County. My wife Lorraine drove herself to the hospital because I was stuck under a collapsed drainage tunnel on the east side of the city. Couldn't get away. By the time I made it to St. Vincent's, she was already holding him. She looked up at me and she wasn't even angry. She just said, "You missed it, but he's perfect. Come see." He was. He really was. Brandon is 41 now. He works in commercial real estate in Seattle. Married a woman named Sylvia 12 years ago. They have a daughter, Lily, who just turned 9 and who sends me crayon drawings in the mail because she knows I take them to my refrigerator. Those drawings are still there, even after everything. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. Lorraine passed in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that gives you very little warning and takes you very fast. We were married for 38 years. She was the only person in my life who ever made me feel like the version of myself I actually wanted to be. After she died, I didn't know what to do with the quiet. The house in Portland had 4 bedrooms and one of me, and some nights the silence had a physical weight to it, like water pressure at the bottom of something deep. Brandon called every week, sometimes twice. He sounded worried, but in that particular way, adult children sound worried about their aging parents, like they're checking a box. Are you eating? Are you getting out? Dad, you really should look into one of those medical alert systems. I told him I was fine. I was 67 years old, not 90. I still drove, still did my own grocery shopping, still met my old colleague Phil for coffee on Thursday mornings at a place on Alberta Street where they knew our order before we sat down. That was my life. Quiet, small, mine. The supplement showed up 8 months after Lorraine died. Brandon drove down from Seattle for a long weekend. He brought Sylvia and Lily, and for 2 days the house felt like a house again instead of a museum. Lily ran through the backyard. Sylvia made a pot of soup. Brandon fixed the gutter on the north side that I'd been meaning to get to for 6 months. On Sunday morning before they left, Brandon put a white paper bag on the kitchen counter. "We've been researching this," he said. "Sylvia and I. It's a supplement program. Supports cognitive function, cardiovascular health, joint inflammation, all the stuff you need to be thinking about at your age." He pulled out 3 amber bottles. "This one in the morning, this one at night, this one with lunch, completely natural. Doctor formulated." Sylvia handed me a pamphlet. She was smiling that careful smile she had, the one I could never fully read. I looked at the bottles. They had clean labels, professional printing, ingredient lists I didn't entirely understand. "Your mother's family had heart issues," Brandon said, "and with Alzheimer's on Dad's side, we just want to be proactive. We love you. We want you around." I thought of Lorraine. I thought of her father, who forgot her name 2 years before he died. I thought about the fear that lives in the back of your mind when you've watched someone you love disappear from the inside. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." I kissed Lily on the top of her head, watched them back out of the driveway, stood at the door until the car turned the corner and was gone. Then I opened the first bottle and took the morning pill. January came. Portland in winter is grey in a particular way, not dramatic, just persistent. I kept to my routines. Thursday coffee with Phil. Walking the neighborhood after dinner, even when it was cold. reading in Lorraine's chair by the window because it still smelled like her, and I wasn't ready to stop needing that. The headache started around mid-January. I'd never been a headache person. Lorraine used to tease me about it, said my head was like a cinder block. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. But these were different. A steady, dull drumming behind my left eye that started in the afternoon and stayed through the night. I figured it was the dry winter air or the screen time or just the grinding, ordinary sadness of being 67 and alone. I kept taking supplements. By February, my sleep went wrong. I'd fall asleep fine, but wake up at 2, sometimes 3 in the morning, completely alert, heart going fast, a faint ringing in my ears. I couldn't place. I'd lie there in the dark and listen to the house and try to remember what I'd been dreaming, but it was always gone. Brandon called and I mentioned the sleep trouble. He sounded concerned. "Dad, that's your cortisol. Classic stress response in older adults. The supplements should help regulate it over time, but it takes a few months to build up in your system. Are you taking them consistently?" I was. "Good. Stay with it." In March, my hands started doing something they'd never done before. A slight tremor. Not dramatic, just enough that I noticed it. Holding my coffee mug, I could see the surface of the liquid vibrate slightly. I set the mug down and stared at it for a long time. I was an engineer. My hands had been steady my entire career. Steady hands, steady numbers, steady outcomes. I called my doctor, a man named Dr. Osei, who I'd seen for 15 years, who had a photograph of his 4 daughters on his desk, and a handshake that felt like it meant something. He ran blood work, EKG, a neurological screen. I sat in the beige exam room afterward while he reviewed the results. "Nothing here jumps out at me as alarming," he said. "Some of these numbers I'd want to keep an eye on, but you're in decent shape for 67. The tremor is mild. Could be a central tremor, which is benign. Very common. Could be fatigue-related. Let's check again in 3 months." I didn't tell him about the supplements. I didn't think they were relevant. They were natural. Doctor formulated. The label said so. That was the assumption that almost killed me. April. I started losing weight without trying to. 5 pounds, then 8, then 11. My appetite had flatlined. Food that I used to enjoy tasted blunted, like the volume had been turned down on everything. Phil noticed at Thursday coffee. He said I looked like I was disappearing. I laughed it off. The cognitive stuff started that month too. I'd be doing something ordinary, paying a bill, reading an article, and I'd realize I had no idea how long I'd been sitting there. I'd lose the thread of conversations. I'd walk into the garage and stand there genuinely uncertain why I'd come. One afternoon I called Phil and, in the middle of the call, forgot his name. Just momentarily completely gone. I stood there on my own kitchen floor holding the phone, listening to him say hello, hello, and I could not find the word for who he was. I hung up. I sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were shaking. My father had had dementia. I watched it take him over 7 years, the way it started with little things, forgetting where he put his keys, then forgetting what keys were for, then forgetting that I was his son. I had spent the better part of my adult life being afraid of that. Now I sat at my own kitchen table and thought, here it is. Here it is coming for me too. Brandon came down in early May. Just him this time. No Sylvia, no Lily. He took me to lunch and listened carefully while I described what had been happening. He nodded in all the right places. He looked worried in a way that seemed genuine. "I think we need to get you assessed properly," he said. "Not Dr. Osei. He's a GP. You need a neurologist. There's a specialist in Seattle, one of the top cognitive decline guys in the Pacific Northwest. Sylvia's already reached out to his office. We can get you in next week." Something about the way he said that. The speed of it. Sylvia's already reached out. Before I'd even agreed to go. I didn't sit with that feeling long enough. I should have. I drove to Seattle the following Wednesday. Brand met me at a clinic in the Eastlake neighborhood, glass and steel, the kind of building that communicates serious medicine. The specialist was a man named Dr. Aldridge, mid-50s, efficient, spoke the way people speak when they've delivered difficult news many times and have learned to keep their voice level. He ran tests for 2 hours, memory exercises, motor coordination, an MRI, a complete neurological evaluation. When he called me into his office with the results, Brandon came too. "There are some patterns here that concern me," Dr. Aldridge said. "The combination of cognitive symptoms, the tremor, the sleep disruption, the weight loss, it's consistent with early-stage neurodegeneration. I'd like to start you on a medication protocol now. The research on early intervention is strong. We can slow the progression significantly." He slid a prescription across the desk. I looked at it. I looked at my son. Brandon's face was steady, composed, caring, the face of a devoted son receiving hard news about his father with grace. "We'll get through this, Dad," he said. And he put his hand on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of it, the familiar weight of my own kid's hand. And I thought, this is what's real. Whatever is happening to my brain, this is still real. I filled the prescription at the pharmacy downstairs. Round white tablets, 1 in the evening, 2 in the morning. I stayed with Brandon and Sylvia for a week. Their house in Eastlake was large and quiet. Lily brought me drawings while I sat in the guest room. Sylvia made sure my water glass was always full. Brandon came home from work and asked about my day with an attentiveness that I told myself was love. One night I woke up at 3 in the morning with a pain behind my eyes, unlike anything I'd ever felt. Not a headache, something more invasive than that, like pressure building from the inside. I got up and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked old, not 67 old. Old in a way that felt accelerated, hollowed out. My skin had a color to it I didn't recognize, and standing there in that bathroom at 3 in the morning in my son's house, I thought about a thing that had been circling the edges of my mind for weeks without ever quite landing. Sylvia had asked me, a few months back, in a very casual way about my pension. About the house. "Just want to make sure everything's organized in case anything ever happens," she'd said, smiling. "Estate planning, you know. Brandon worries." At the time it had seemed reasonable. I was 67. I'd recently lost my spouse. Of course it was sensible to have those conversations. Standing in that mirror at 3 in the morning, it didn't seem so reasonable anymore. I went back to Portland 2 days later. I told Brandon I wanted to recover at home. He didn't argue. He drove me to the station and hugged me on the platform and told me to call him every day. I waved from the window as the train pulled out. I watched his figure get smaller and then disappear. I kept taking the supplements. I kept taking the new medication. I didn't know yet that I should stop. May turned into June. I fell once in the kitchen reaching for something on a high shelf. I fell once in the garden, just lost my footing on uneven ground, caught myself on the fence, but still went down hard enough to bruise my hip badly. Phil came over and helped me ice it, and didn't say anything judgmental, but I could see the worry on his face. I got thinner. I got slower. My world contracted. On a Tuesday in late June I was walking the neighborhood after dinner. I cut it shorter lately, just around the block instead of the mile loop I used to do. The evening was warm, late summer light, that gold hour that Portland does beautifully. I made it 3/4 of the way around the block. Then the sidewalk tilted. I've thought about that moment a lot since. The way it happened without warning. One step was fine. The next step the world shifted. 15 degrees and kept shifting, and I couldn't find horizontal anymore. I put my hand out and caught a neighbor's front fence and held on. Then my legs quit, and I went down onto the grass strip between the fence and the sidewalk, and I just lay there looking up at the sky, which was pink and gold and completely indifferent. A woman named Rosa, who lived 3 houses down and whose last name I still don't know, saw me go down from her porch. She called 911 before she even came over to me. I remember her face above mine. The evening sky behind her. "Don't move," she said. "Help is coming." I woke up in the ambulance. There was a paramedic working on my left arm, and another driving. The one working on me was a woman, early 40s, hair pulled back, competent hands, the kind of professional calm that you can feel in a person's proximity. She asked me my name. I told her. "Mr. Calloway," I need to ask you about what medications you're currently taking. Can you tell me everything you're taking? I listed them. Dr. Osei's blood pressure medication, the vitamin D he'd recommended, the round white tablets from Dr. Aldridge, and the supplements. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatic, just a slight change in the area around her eyes. How long have you been taking the supplements? 6 months, I told her. Since last November. She looked at her colleague in the front, then back at me. Mr. Colleague in the front, then back at me. Calloway, she said, I need you to tell me who gave you those supplements. My son, I said. He researched them for me. He and his wife. They were worried about my health. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The ambulance moved through Portland streets, sirens, the familiar geography of a city I had spent my adult life in. When we get to the hospital, she said carefully, I'm going to need to make a call. Her name was Paramedic Lena Torres, and she had seen something like this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. 3 days after I was admitted to Oregon Health and Science University, a man in civilian clothes came to my hospital room. He introduced himself as an investigator with the Oregon Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Unit. He had kind eyes and a recorder he set on the table between us and asked if I minded. He told me what the hospital toxicology panel had found. The supplements weren't supplements. The amber bottles with the clean professional labels and the ingredient lists I hadn't questioned contained a combination of compounds, one of which was a chelating agent, a substance that bonds to minerals in the bloodstream and removes them. The kind of thing used in actual medicine under controlled conditions at precise doses. Used incorrectly, accumulated over months, it strips the body of minerals essential to neurological function, causes tremors, cognitive disruption, weight loss, cardiovascular instability, slow, gradual, exactly the profile of age-related decline. The white tablets from Dr. Aldridge, which I later learned was not his real name and whose license I later learned did not check out, were a low-grade sedative compounded with a substance that mimics early neurodegeneration on standard MRI imaging. They had been engineering my symptoms, designing my decline, creating a picture of a 69-year-old man falling apart in ways that were completely believable because they were happening to a 69-year-old man. I lay in that hospital bed and listened to the investigator explain this to me, and I did not cry. I didn't have the feeling that would become crying yet. I just listened, the way I used to listen to presentations about bridge load tolerances. Taking in the data, making sure the numbers were right. Then he told me about the life insurance policy. 18 months ago, Brandon had arranged for a $750,000 life insurance policy in my name, as my power of attorney, for which I had signed documents that I believed were estate planning paperwork during a visit 18 months ago. He had the authority to do so. The policy named him and Sylvia as co-beneficiaries. My house, appraised at $620,000 in today's market, had also been placed in a trust structure that would transfer to Brandon upon my death without going through probate. My retirement accounts, my pension, the proceeds of 31 years of careful, steady work. All of it. I asked the investigator how he found out. Lena Torres, he said. She had seen an unusual pattern, older patients presenting with symptom profiles that didn't quite cohere, and she'd made a report 3 months ago that sat in a queue somewhere until my case connected to it. A paramedic I'd never met before the night she kept me alive had been the one paying attention. I called Brandon from the hospital. I kept my voice weak. I told him I was worse, that the doctors were worried, that I was frightened. He said he and Sylvia would come down. I said, please, yes, I need you here. They arrived the following morning. What happened in the parking garage of OHSU that Thursday is something I have replayed many times. Brandon was carrying a coffee from the place on the ground floor. Sylvia had a tote bag. They were talking to each other, walking through the structure toward the elevator, normal people on a normal errand. 2 Oregon DOJ investigators approached them. I wasn't there. I was upstairs in my hospital room. But one of the investigators described it to me later. Brandon's face, he said, went very still. Not guilty, not afraid, not the way you might expect. Just still, like a calculation running. Sylvia started crying immediately. They were both taken in for questioning. By the end of the week, the charges were filed. The investigation took 7 months. It was thorough. The bottles were traced to a manufacturer through channels I still don't fully understand. Emails on Branden's laptop mapped out the progression of what he and Sylvia had planned, when to escalate, what symptoms to expect, how to position themselves as devoted caregivers while the process ran its course. Texts showed them discussing my doctor appointments with the clinical detachment of project managers reviewing milestones. There was a moment in the trial that I will never fully move past. Brandon's lawyer put Sylvia on the stand and built a case that she had been the architect, the one who researched it, who sourced it, who convinced Brandon that he had been weak and led, that he hadn't understood, not really, what they were doing. Maybe that's partly true. I don't know. What I know is that Brandon knew I was sick and he kept handing me the bottles. Knew I was losing weight, losing my footing, losing pieces of myself. And he called every week to ask how I was doing in a voice that sounded like a son's voice. I know what I heard in that voice. I know that I believed it. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Brandon, 18 years, attempted murder in the first degree, elder financial abuse, fraud, conspiracy. Sylvia, 11 years on reduced charges. Dr. Mesra, Aldridge, whose real name I will not write here because I'm not interested in giving him anything, including letters, 14 years, medical fraud, criminal conspiracy, reckless endangerment. I haven't been back to the courtroom since the verdicts. I have not visited Brandon. Lily was placed with Sylvia's parents in Spokane. They send me photographs sometimes. She turned 9 in March. In her last picture, she was missing her 2 front teeth and holding a soccer trophy and grinning the kind of grin that belongs entirely to being 9 years old. I wrote her a letter back. I told her about the garden, about Lorraine's roses that came back again this spring. I didn't tell her anything else. That's not mine to tell her. After the trial, I sold the house in Portland. I couldn't argue with myself into staying. The house had been built around a life that existed with Lorraine in it, and then it had been built around a life that existed with Brandon as my son. And neither of those things was what it had been. And I was 68 years old, and I didn't have the energy to haunt a house anymore. I moved north, a small house in Astoria, right on the coast, where the Columbia meets the Pacific. The fog comes in thick in the mornings and burns off by noon, and the light that's left is the clearest light I've ever seen. I walk every morning along the waterfront. There's a coffee place on Commercial Street where the woman behind the counter knows I take it black and has it ready when she sees me come through the door. Small things. The texture of ordinary days. Phil retired last year, and he and his wife Joan make the drive up once a month. We sit on my deck and watch the water and argue about baseball the way we have for 20 years, and sometimes we don't say much at all. Lena Torres came to visit once. She brought her husband and her 2 kids, and I made too much food the way you do when you're a person who doesn't cook for anyone anymore and used to cook for 4. We sat at the table, and her kids ate everything, and her husband laughed easily, and she and I talked about the case for a little while, and then talked about other things. Before they left, she said, "I'm glad you were still on the street when Rosa called." I said, "Me too. The doctors at OHSU say the damage to my system is real but not permanent. My hands are mostly steady now. The cognitive fog lifted about 4 months after I stopped taking the supplements, like a window being cleaned from the outside, the world getting sharper in increments. I still have headaches sometimes, less than before. I sleep through the night more often than not. I think about Brandon. I've been trying, since the verdict, to locate the place inside myself where the question lives. Not whether what he did was wrong. That's not a question. I think about the boy who used to bring me drawings the same way Lily does now, who learned to ride a bike in the driveway on a Saturday morning with me running alongside holding the back of the seat, who stood at Lorraine's grave and couldn't stop shaking, who I held up with one arm because his grief was too big for his body. That person is somewhere inside the man who sat across from a laptop screen and planned out the arc of my dying. I don't know how to reconcile those 2 people. I've stopped trying to do it quickly. Maybe it's work that takes years. Maybe it takes the rest of my life. Maybe I'll get to the end of it and still not have a clean answer. What I've decided for now is not to let the not knowing stop me from being here. I'm here, in Astoria, with the fog and the coffee and Phil's voice on the phone and Lily's letters that I still tape to the refrigerator next to Lorraine's photograph. Last fall, I started volunteering with a literacy program for adults in Clatsop County. 2 mornings a week, I sit across a table from someone who is learning to read at 45 or 55 or 60, and I think about all the years that reading has given me, and I try to give some of that forward. There's a man in the program, about my age, who showed up the first day so self-conscious he could barely make eye contact. By December, he was reading a chapter book with his granddaughter. He told me about it with a kind of wonder in his voice that I recognized, the wonder of a door opening that he thought was locked. I keep going back for that. There is a woman I've been talking to. Her name is June. She's 65, retired schoolteacher. She lost her husband 4 years ago to a stroke that happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon and rearranged everything. We met in mine at the post office, of all places, arguing mildly with a clerk about whether a package needed extra postage, and she turned to me to corroborate her position. And we both ended up laughing at ourselves, standing there in that fluorescent light. We've had dinner a few times, walked the waterfront. She has very strong opinions about documentary films, and she knows more about migratory birds than anyone I've ever met. And she makes me laugh, which is something I didn't know I still needed until it started happening again. I'm not building toward anything. I learned something this past year about what it means to be alive in the time you actually have, as opposed to the time you imagined having. I'm not managing toward an outcome. I'm just here, present in the morning. Present at the table, present when June tells me about a bird she saw on the headland that she'd never seen in Clatsop County before. Present when I tape another letter from Lily to the refrigerator. Present when I walk out to the water in the early morning before the fog has burned off, and I stand there at the edge of the continent, and I breathe in and I breathe out, and I think, I'm still here. That's the whole of it. That's everything. My name is Edward Calloway. I am 69 years old. I am a retired structural engineer, a widower, a grandfather in the way that matters, and a man who almost wasn't. I built things designed to hold weight. I am still standing. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say it was the collapse or the hospital, or sitting in a courtroom listening to prosecutors describe my own son's emails. But honestly, the hardest part was earlier than all of that. The hardest part was standing in my kitchen every morning, shaking a pill into my palm from a bottle my son had handed me with both hands, and feeling grateful. That's the part I carry. Not the betrayal itself, but how completely I didn't see it coming, and how much I didn't want to. I think about cause and effect a lot now. I was an engineer for over 3 decades. Everything I built was governed by it. Apply a force here, get a predictable result there. The math doesn't lie, and it doesn't make exceptions. What I've learned, slowly and at considerable cost, is that the same principle runs through human choices. Brandon made a series of decisions, each one small enough to seem manageable, each one building on the last. The first lie leads to the second. The second makes the third necessary. By the time Sylvia was exchanging emails about progression timelines for my decline, they had traveled so far from any version of themselves, I would have recognized that there was no single moment I could point to and say, that's where it went wrong. It went wrong in increments. It went wrong the way a structure fails, not all at once, but through the slow accumulation of stresses that nobody addressed. I don't say this to excuse what they did. I say it because I think it's important to understand how ordinary people end up doing terrible things. Not monsters. People who started somewhere recognizable and kept walking in the wrong direction until recognizable was a very long way behind them. What I've had to reckon with in the quieter months since the trial is my own part in it, not guilt. I am clear that I am not responsible for what Brandon chose, but I stayed willfully incurious. I didn't question the supplements because questioning them would have meant questioning my son, and I wasn't ready to do that. I trusted the label because I trusted the hands that gave it to me. That trust wasn't a flaw, but the refusal to use my own judgment alongside it. That was something I had to look at honestly. The mind I have is still the mind I've always had. It was compromised for a while, chemically, deliberately. But it came back, and one of the first things I did when it came back clearly was decide that I would never again outsource my own discernment, because someone I loved seemed to know better. Love is not the same as deference. You can love people completely and still ask hard questions. You can trust people and still verify. I should have known that. I built bridges. I never once said, I trust the contractor, so I won't check the load calculations. What I'm still learning, At 69, living in Astoria with fog in the mornings and coffee going cold on the deck, is that resilience isn't a dramatic thing. It's not the moment you survive. It's the Tuesday after that and the Wednesday after that, choosing to get up and go to the waterfront and breathe the cold air and be present in the actual life you actually have. Brandon stole months from me. He did not get to have the rest. That part was always mine. I just had to decide to take it back. I still tape Lily's letters to the refrigerator. She is 9 years old, and she didn't choose any of this. Neither did I. But here we both are, still in the world, still sending things back and forth across the distance between us. That feels like something worth protecting. So that's what I do.